Wow. Did you write this? Goodin's in the House interview with Nick Goodin. Did you write that?
No.
How the hell did that happen? That's interesting. Okay. That's really great. Today I'm posting it right now. 2 hours talking about the most important subject in everyone's life. That's my hyperbole. Storytelling.
Yeah. Gosh, I'll believe that.
Yeah.
I'm committed to my bias on that. There's not too many things the older I get, and I have some mentors or wise people that I look up to. Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah, as the older I get and as the mentors that I look up to are now in their like 80s and stuff, there's a relaxing on the grip of right and it to be so black and white. And one of my favorite mentors is Father Richard Rohr. He's like this old Jesuit priest who's pretty rowdy and ornery. And I heard him say recently in an interview, and he's definitely geared for perfection. I mean, that's kind of how he's most of his life, he's seen it this way or that way. And he's like, well, now that I'm at a point in life where I'm just like, well, I don't know, maybe. And he's like, it's just been so much lighter in life, being able to relax my psychology on a lot of things. It doesn't mean that I don't have opinions, but I'm open to the idea, more open now than ever to the idea that I could be radically wrong at any moment. It doesn't mean that I'm like just wishy-washy, float around. Yeah, you're right. No, you're right. Just means I'm listening for possibility that I would normally be shut off to.
Yeah. It's an interesting idea. And let me introduce you, please. Hi, everybody. Yeah. It's Mike again from Thinking with Mike, episode 9. And this week, my very special guest is Nick Goodin. Nick Goodin is, I don't know what you'd call him. He's like a professional story man. He works with companies like the Order of St. Francis Hospitals in Peoria. He does consulting, but his bag is he's all about storytelling, and it's important in the human race and in your life, not just as an art form, but in your own personal narrative, whether it's a business or your marriage or just your existence. So he's an incredibly cool cat. I met him a few years ago when I was doing an intense business workshop at Bradley University. So welcome, Nick. Welcome to Thinking with Mike.
Yeah, thank you. I'm honored to be here. And I think the biggest honor is, I said this to you the other day, is like looking at your guest lineup, and it was an impressive lineup of people that are really, I think, making some waves in the world, making a difference. And I'm excited that you've considered me to come and share a little bit with the people that you seek to serve with this podcast.
Yeah, and all you guys have one thing kind of in common, I think, and that's mission. Which interests me about people, when I can see a person with a mission and they've made that kind of their North Star, and over time they accumulate a kind of momentum, right, of lived experiences aiming at that star, and they become a pretty interesting person for me because I want to know what drives them, and they become an expert in whatever that thing is. So, and you're an expert kind of on such a deep, like Chris Brownell was an expert on math, which I think is a very deep concept, right? Because it's like measuring the world. Storytelling is a deeper concept because it's pre-math, it's precognition in a way. It goes back to like fundamental ways our brain works and how we actually process and package and reciprocate data. It's so fundamental. So I'm very excited about today's episode. So did I miss anything in my introduction of you?
No, this is great. Thank you for the introduction. And I would agree with you. You titled this as maybe one of the most fundamental parts of human life is storytelling. And I mentioned to you beforehand, as like, I will commit to my bias on that. I agree. I think it is one of the most important things.
Yeah. And I think that culturally speaking right now, we have a lot of people who and we had one episode about not confirmation bias, but similar, but hanging on to a narrative. When we establish in our brain a narrative, a kind of a story about what's going on, the longer it's been entrenched in us, the harder it is to shake loose, even if it's not true. We need these things. Is that a fair way of thinking about it? Because I don't want to make it too negative. It's an important process, right, of thinking, is to have narratives, but they can get in the way.
Yeah, well, I'll take one step back and say, you mentioned at the top about maybe pre-math, precognition, and I've heard someone say one of the greatest innovations of mankind is storytelling, because of its power to shape reality, for its power to change and break dynasties and change cultures, and that those are on large scales, but even within ourselves, their ability to either open up potential and possibility for us,
Right.
and also their ability to limit what we see and what we experience. So if you think about any one of us that's in this current moment right now where we're at, we're a makeup of belief systems and values. Some we profess as values, some we don't even recognize anymore. They're just inherently, we open doors for little old ladies and we pick up trash on the side of the street, whatever they may be. You don't even think about it. It's so subconscious anymore. And when you talk about old stories, or story that's been with us for a very long time, it's so old that we don't even know that it's really there anymore, or the origin story of why the certain behavior's here. Why is it that I feel compelled to open a door for a little old lady, or I feel compelled to notice trash? My eyes see trash. Maybe someone else might not see trash on the side of the street the same way I do. Why is that? There's an old story that, again, is probably long forgotten. And you're right, it not necessarily has to be a negative thing. It could be a very positive thing. It could just shaped, you could have a great teacher, a great coach, a really defining moment with your father or your mother, that shapes a lot of the way that you show up in the world today. Now, again, this could be positive or negative. The problems that we run into in life a lot of times is that when these old stories start to get in the way of a new story we're trying to step into. And because they're so old and they're like Grand Canyon deep neural pathways, they're just constantly instinctual. Again, we don't even realize they're there. It's very hard for us to even get a handle on why we can't push forward, why we can't break through, why we can't get the business up and running, why we can't start the business, or why we can't write the book, whatever it may be we're trying to do in the world, or why we can't get along with people, why we can't figure out the relationship with our kids, is understanding that there's a whole series of stories that make up who we are right now. And the brain is so wired for narrative that it can't help but start to put things in buckets. And generally speaking, those buckets usually are full of a little bit of fact and a whole lot of fiction.
A lot of assumptions.
The world.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And we just don't have enough information, and that's okay. It's not to say we could ever get it like, every T crossed, every dot. That's irrational to think that that's possible. But to say, like, for anybody that's listening right now, to say to them, like, if the thing that you are wanting to see happen the most in life right now, if some new story you want to see happen in your life, and again, we could talk about the details of how story works in our brain, but just simply just take a moment and say, what's the thing that I want to see happen the most?
Right.
And if I could know what's keeping me from that, would I want to know? Would I be willing to go and look in it? And Joseph Campbell quote, would I be willing to go into the cave, that I least want to go into, but where the treasure is that I'm willing to go for, that I seek is in this cave. Would I be willing to go into it? And the exciting thing is, I think as a culture, we're getting more and more people talking about mental well-being, We're getting more and more people talking about how what's going on upstairs actually really matters in the way that we interact and show up in the world. And we're creating space to say a person isn't just, well, they're just like this. Because when we say, oh, a person is just like this, then that really is saying, well, there's no potential for any other new future. They're just like this, right?
Yeah.
And we can say that to ourselves, right? And that's an old story. That's us being committed to something we really don't even want to be committed to, but it's so old because maybe our dad or our mom said, you know what, you're just like that. Every time you do this, you know, you're just like your uncle, blah, blah, blah. He was a failure too. Again, it doesn't have to be always negative. I work with a lot of high performers who have had the other end of the spectrum of, let's say, maybe they didn't have a parent that spoke down to them very often. Maybe they had a parent that like overpraised them, and like everything they did was amazing. Everything they achieved, and they achieved a lot, you know. They were the best at every sport they played. They were the best at everything they did. And then they get out into the world and one thing, even the tiniest thing starts to fall apart, and the world starts spinning out of control for them because they've never known a narrative where they're not winning, or they're not achieving, or they're not being praised for something. And so not only are we narrative machines, but a lot of that narrative is to keep us safe. And that's like our primitive part of our brain, to keep us safe, very basic, you know, needs, our basic needs met. And belonging is one of those really big basic needs that we're unaware of, that we're constantly checking that out. Who's up, who's out, who's in, who's down, right? We're constantly looking left and right. And even, again, a lot of this is subconscious. We walk into a meeting, walk into a room. Do we know these people? Where's my status in this group, right? We're always thinking about this. Am I the leader? Am I not the leader? Am I the low man on the totem pole? Did I say something stupid last time, so now I'm not going to say anything at all? You know, all this stuff is swirling around in our brains. And at the same time, we're trying to get stuff done. We're trying to do our best work, or we're trying to make something happen no one's ever made happen before. We're trying to bring something new into the world, something creative, and maybe something to help society, whatever it is. I guess the question would be is, again, to go back to the question I asked before, like if you could have more resource, like if there was more resource available to you right now than you ever imagined, but it was just hidden in plain sight, would you want to know?
Right. I feel like I'm developing a thought here. And it's like stepping away isn't the same as stepping back. That we live in our stories, and we're gung-ho on our stories. Maybe we want to change our story, but we want to go by a story. But you're suggesting there's another kind of metacognition where we could step back and still have agency, but now we're like looking at ourselves as a thing that does this thing, right? And it's kind of like creating a new executive level of functioning where we're treating ourselves as a thing that does this thing, right? We're aware of it. And because we're aware of it, we can change some of the ground rules and say, for instance, I see each person I run into is that cave. And in that cave that I'm looking at, they might be Republican. And I normally, in my old story, I freaking hate Republicans. But I'm not going to look at that person as just that. I'm going to look at the person as a cave. And in that cave is a freaking treasure. Until proven otherwise, that's how I'm going to treat them. That changes a lot, because it elevates the ability of the imagination to be lateral, to be 360 degrees, and to you get more power in your life because you're not limiting your experience with people, and you might be rewarded by these people because you're also treating them with kind of a respect that they have something to offer. Am I hearing you right in that assessment?
Yeah, no, you're correct. So how I would, I guess, create some framework around it is the idea that at any given moment, there's more information around us than we can ever process, right? Like, especially in today's age, the information streaming us at a million miles an hour.
Right.
And our brains are machines, let's just say that. And it's a machine that primarily exists to keep us alive. And because the brain burns more energy, like, in a minute of rest than your thigh does in an entire marathon, it is really good at running these subconscious control systems. Let's just call them that. That like, hey, can we just run these on auto? Let's keep all these things on auto. And if they're on auto, you don't have to think about them, so you can conserve energy and enjoy the things that are in front of you, or enjoy how amazing, the food is that you're eating, or whatever it may be, right? You're not having to think about, do I need to regulate body temperature? Or do I need to regulate, my heart rate? Anything like that. Like, but those like metaphysical, like keeping yourself alive stuff, also, it also plays into the, where do I stand in the world around me, right? And when we're in autopilot, for most of us, and we all do this, there is it's not a light switch. You don't just become like, this super metacognition. I think about my thinking at the highest level, and I don't like it. It takes community, and it takes time to build this ability to think about our thinking, to see this outside of us, and to see that there might be more resource or more information that I need to listen for in another's conversation. And the challenge is that because a lot of this is so subconscious, we have to intentionally break it. We have to intentionally do some work to start to loosen what I would call the flexibility of our psychology.
Yeah. Yeah.
How flexible is it that, like you mentioned, Republicans and Democrats is a great example, or it could just be, hey, I see the solution to this problem is path A and you see path B. Well, am I more committed to solving the problem or more committed to being right? Now, that commitment to being right, like more than anything that we know of, is more addictive than sex, drugs, alcohol, anything out there, is this commitment, this like addiction of being right. So again, because that runs on that subconscious plane, most of the times we don't even realize that we may be starting to feel threatened, and our status or our standing in a group, let's say, starts to feel threatened. And then we revert back to these very primal responses, right? Look good, feel good, be right, be in control.
Right.
Because
let me interject real quick, because I think that was a big subject in the last couple of years, has been that. And I'm a Catholic, so I have Catholic friends, and I like to think that I'm more critical of my own tribe than other people's tribes, because you should start with your own family, your own self, right? And I heard this zeal to be right as trumping what shouldn't be trumped, which is the zeal to be good and loving. Right.
Yeah.
And to me, the mission of Christ was to be loving first, leave the righteousness to God, the judgment especially. Right. So when I hear people that they're kind of reiterating their righteous beliefs, their righteous foothold, their righteous little causes they're going to vote for in a politician, all this stuff, these litmus tests of righteousness, I'm like, there's life beyond righteousness. There's life beyond winning an argument and being right all the time. Listening with love is a powerful thing. You're not going to die if you just listen to somebody whose opinion you don't like. You're not going to fail, or if you don't fail by losing an argument, right? You might actually win in the long run by losing arguments and by letting people listening to their whole thought process play out in front of you. Right. So, I've been really into that idea that like there's a problem with that addiction of being right all the time.
Yeah, and it goes back to storytelling, right?
Yeah.
What stories did you grow up around that now have become a part of your psychology, your belief system? And how are those? And I like to think about it as like, anytime we experience something, we're not actually experiencing what we think we see. We're actually experiencing, like, say, I'll be more clear. When I say experiencing, the feelings we're getting, right? Feeling happy, feeling excited, feeling threatened, whatever the feelings we get. We think that's how the feeling is the direct connection to what we're seeing, hearing, whatever. But there's actually a filter in between. And that filter is our perception of the event. that's happening. And that filter is made up of all those old stories, made up of all of, and for good and for bad. And maybe not even, I'll take that back. I won't even say bad. Maybe not necessarily, because I'm careful not to like prescribe this is, you know, bad or wrong. Sometimes we don't understand it yet, and we need to know a little bit more about it. But you know, that filter in between is our, you know, is made up of values and old stories and experiences that built those stories. And it's like, what if you could take that filter in between? Do you remember the I don't remember the brand, maybe like it was like a Fisher Price thing, but it was like a kid's toy, and you had these white discs with these
Yeah.
little black slides in them, and
Yeah.
you put the disc in and
Yeah.
you would chunk.
Yeah. What were those called? Yeah. I had tons of those.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What if you could do some work and be able to, you know, jockey that filter around a little bit, or even be willing to take that filter out. And really what's happening when we're learning how to listen to others and look for options that we just haven't been able to even allow our brains to imagine, what's happening is we're taking that filter out and we're putting a new filter in, maybe only momentarily. And maybe it's fuzzy and it hurts and doesn't feel good and it's not comfortable, but we start to understand that there is more opportunity,
Right.
more potential for the things that we're trying to get done. And
Let me bring back the storytelling though, because
yeah,
we talked about this before. We in a podcast with Brett Weinstein and Eric Jordan Peterson, we're talking about the way they were processing each other's thoughts. The process of storytelling, when you tell a story about your experience, it's not only for the listeners' behalf benefit that they're hearing what you experienced, but in the process of storytelling, you have to kind of come to terms with your experience, your raw data, and come to terms with your preconceived notions, and you're basically learning for yourself a second time what you experienced in the storytelling. So it's not just for the listener, but it's also for the storyteller. The process of cognition is happening for them too. It might be more important. And so when you hear somebody tell you something, it might be helpful to not talk at them with a pre-made response, like, oh, I got a gotcha response. I know just how to respond to what you just said. But instead say, when I'm hearing what you just said is this. You just said blah, 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 blah. Not in a pedantic kind of boring way, but like,
yeah,
am I getting you right? Are you saying this? Because you're also flattering that person that you listen to them.
yeah,
And they might
yeah,
say, actually, yeah, but what I really meant was this. And you're honing the communication, because as we
yes,
know, communication sucks with human beings. It's terrible. So the subject becomes the communication, not necessarily the contest.
yeah.
And there's something beautiful about that.
I think it starts with a question like, why am I even here? Why am
Yeah.
I in this conversation? Like,
Right.
what's my intention in this conversation? Is my intention, and I coach a lot of people that are about to have a difficult conversation. And I one of the things I tell them is, one of the best things you can do first is set the intention. By the end of this conversation, I would really like us to get to X. Like, here's the intention for this conversation. So first, you know, my intention. What would you like? Just slow down enough to say, what would you like to get to by the end of this conversation? To invite the purpose of the conversation up to the top first. Because
Right. And that was fleshing out the importance of storytelling, why it's important. And let's talk about that. That was my intention.
yeah. And so to bring it to that level too, is to say that, you know, I think there is something that's kind of connecting for me as you're sharing that, is that a lot of times we show up in conversations and we're using bits and pieces, facts and figures, maybe more little anecdotal, you know, like, well, this is why I was late. The car had a flat tire, right? And sometimes that's all that's needed for communication. But a lot of times there's more to the story. A lot of times there's so much more information, and by holding space like you described, by inviting people to share more, and there's a couple tools I'd like to share that help that, like open that window. for storytelling, for people to be more explaining. One of those is to take, and I learned this from Chris Voss. One of those steps is to take like the I or you out of the equation, and use phrases like "it sounds like," because you is a trigger word, like, you know, or I could be a trigger word because now I'm saying I know what's best. Again, like, depends on how the person's maybe perceiving or where they're at in the conversation. Maybe you don't know, but by saying it sounds like, it seems like, it looks like, instead of you said this, or I think it sounds like you said this. By taking that out, you're inviting them without like any triggers to open more.
Say it again.
Really,
you remove the pronouns. Say it again. Like what exactly
so
is the phrase?
Sounds like. So you're using the word it instead
You're not
of
saying
you.
I hear.
You're
not saying I hear what you're saying. You're
Yeah.
not saying that at
Yeah.
all. Yeah.
Mm-mm.
It sounds like,
seems like, looks like.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good way of putting it, because then you're taking out the whole battle of the two egos.
And
right?
Another tool to use for that, is to, and you have to be careful. And I would, and now we're talking about conversational intelligence, which is something I've studied quite a bit. Tone is everything. And if we're having a conversation, we're trying to come together. Yeah. Tone is everything. Controlling your tone, slowing down, even listening to your breathing, listening to your heart rate. If you feel like you're getting flustered, slowing everything down for yourself, right? Like, no one's going to die at the end of this conversation. Let's just slow down, control my breathing, control my tone. And then if someone were to say, I had this happen the other day. I had a conversation with someone that gave some feedback for so we run this thing called Pure Open Coffee Club, and they gave some really good feedback. And I used some of those tools, but then I used this tool I'm about to share. They used the phrase, well, it was just the experience I had was it was like a beginner experience. And so instead of saying like what I imagined, they said what a beginner experience means, I'm like double clicking on what beginner experience, assuming that there's a whole world behind beginner experience that's way different than the world I see when I say here beginner experience. Instead of running on down the path and with the formulation of information that I have in my mind now, I'm going to slow down. So I said beginner experience. And usually if you calmly rephrase or repeat back kind of the last few words in a statement like that, and then use the power of silence, let the silence do the lifting, right? Be patient. That's not that's hard for a lot of people to use silence because they get nervous and then they jump right back in and go back to what they're normally used to. So this takes practice, but that ability, causing that pause, all of a sudden he's like, well, he started to explain way more detail about what beginner experience means. And I could have just simply said, oh, tell me more. How come? Tell me more about beginner experience. But I wanted to leave as much room for him to unpack what that meant without me coloring it in any way or directing it. I wanted to see what's going on in your psychology. And maybe that wasn't even the phrase you meant to say. Yeah. Maybe you meant something else. Maybe the way I perceived it is completely different than what you're meaning. So before we go any further in the conversation, let's be clear about what was just said. Assuming that every word that someone says there's a world behind it, way different than the world we have. They may be pretty similar, but they may be off just enough that we start to drift away in the conversation from each other, and now we're at odds.
Right. My own story, when I was in high school and was leaving high school to go to college, there are a few profound artistic experiences I had that it was at times, it was the late 80s, early 90s, where I think the subject was just in its kernel stages. We see now a world of the Joe Rogan interviews, the long form podcast content, uninterrupted, unedited conversations. But in the mid 80s, there was a movie called My Dinner with Andre, with Andre Gregory and Wally Shawn. And that was Siskel and Ebert said was the greatest movie of the year. It was just basically these two guys playing themselves at a restaurant talking, long form, 2 hours. And it was mind blowing because you got to hear a man, Andre Gregory, talk about exploring what a wife even is, like the idea of a wife, right? And how the thrill of winning a prize is kind of like the thrill of or a good review is the same thrill as having an affair, right? It's a short-term thing, but you have control of it. But having a wife, a long-term relationship, is like that cave. It's an unknown. And this creature you're calling a wife, what is she really? So my point is, they were fleshing out these ideas for the audience, and it was beautiful. Another one was Spalding Gray's Swimming to Cambodia, where he's just talking to the camera with a microphone and a glass of water for 2 hours about filming the killing fields in Cambodia and his experiences as a monologue. It's been made fun of a lot, but we got to see a man really talk about his life as story and repeating and repeating these stories in different ways. And so it was like a new era of breaking down what storytelling is, breaking down the fourth wall of a movie, and feeling like you're in an audience in a garage listening to Spalding Gray. And then the third one I wanted to bring up was Laurie Anderson in Big Science, this album that came out in the 80s that we were introduced to in art school. And it blew my mind because she was taking story to another level, where she was, in fact, the music for the YouTube version of this interview will be a Laurie Anderson piece. Okay. But she took story to another meta level, where she's talking about the assumptions we make when we hear something like we're born and then we die, so happy birthday. Like, she just takes a story and convolutes it and shrinks it and throws it back in your face. So there are all these artists who are these kind of taking story to another meta level, which was really interesting for me because it made me like think about my life and how I'm processing data. So I think it was a cool time to live in the 80s and 90s because you saw all this stuff kind of coming out, right? And people questioning like everything in a really cool way. Not in 1960s, like I hate, the man kind of way, but like what is the floor? What's the foundation of this reality? So anyways, I wanted to bring that up because I think there are ways that you could watch two other people besides yourself trying to do it yourself. You could watch people like in a movie like My Dinner with Andre going deep into a conversation and seeing how this process works out besides just you trying to do it.
Yeah, no, I think that's where, all of this stuff it's overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people it's like, I don't even know how to get there. Like, how do I get to the point where I can think about my thinking and, even ask the question, what is work? What is a job? What is owning a home? What is being in a forest? It seems very, so esoteric that most people like, I don't have time to think that way. But what I'm inviting people to in this conversation this morning is like, well, if you slow down enough to listen and explore bit by bit your thinking, why do I think this way and where did it come from? If you could slow down, you could find more opportunity, more resources, doorways, pathways, whatever you want to call it, that you didn't even realize were just right in front of you. There's just all of this resource right in front of us, but because the way that we color the way we see ourselves, we color the way we see the world, we just don't see it, and if we could change out the filter, we might see a whole new world right in front of us. And so I equate a lot of storytelling to experiences, and I really think a lot of us in this world today, we have experiences that are like predetermined and pretty set. And what I mean by that is, like, we get up, we do our routine, we go to work, we come home, maybe we don't go to work, we go downstairs to the basement now, that's where we work. We do our routine and we get through the day. We just kind of get by. It's like, how can I get by through life with the least amount of pain.
Mhm.
And we don't spend a lot of time exploring. And that the exploring, in my mind, we could use a phrase like wonder. We don't spend a lot of time in wonder, like, oh, I wonder, how does this mechanism work? And this is why I think, you intrigue me as a friend, because you think that way. Like, how does this mechanism work, and why was it built this way? And well, how strong are these magnets, and why are they that strong and not stronger? Right? Like, we don't explore, we don't spend much time in nature. And when we do, it's usually bits and pieces, and we don't slow down enough to ask questions about things around us. So I feel like most of us walk around a little bit bankrupt.
Is it a process of limited self-definition? Is that the problem?
Define limited self-definition.
The way
from
I
your
would define
perspective.
limited self-definition is we tend to define ourselves in our roles and what we do. I'm a dad. I'm a provider.
Mm,
I'm a sports freak. I'm a gardener. Whatever, and
sure.
but geeking out about snails in a pond is something I did when I was 5, but I don't go there anymore. Right. So geeking out about the inside of a 4-stroke engine, I geeked out that when I was 12, but I don't go there anymore. But those default settings of geeking out about snails and engines might still be there, but we've limited ourselves because of the roles and narratives we put we've placed in front of ourselves.
Yeah. So I would ask the question, why? Why have we created this limited identity? What and this isn't like, I'm not asking that as like a global esoteric, humanity. Why? It's like, this would be a great question for someone to ask themselves. Why have I limited myself to this?
Mm-hmm. I think that if people were true to themselves, they would be very eccentric. They'd be kind of freaks. It's like that whole thing, like, when the movies about freaks, where they're hiding their freakishness or mutant, they don't want to be known as a mutant, but we're all freaking mutants, and we're all very, very asymmetric, crazy creatures in our brain. But we try to put off the persona of being, the lawn is cut, the garbage is put away, is been taken out. We're good little citizens, good little soldier citizens, and I think
So
that.
why do you think people do that? Yeah, why do you think people do that?
Because we're sheeple. We're good. We tend to there's a very smart, probably good biological evolutionary explanation of why following the herd is not stupid, and following the herd, it makes life simpler in a lot of ways. But the problem is we're not herd animals. We're primates. We're kind of apex kind of creatures in a huge sense. So I think if human beings followed their default settings more, you'd see Jane Doe housewife all of a sudden becoming more entrepreneurial. You see, Joe Blow 6-pack tinkering in his garage and making machines out of wood. You'd see a lot more kind of Renaissance thinkers. You would. I think you would, because that's what we're geared for that. But that's my opinion. That evolution has put into us. Every human being is that cave, and every human being pretty much has the ability to restart a new civilization, because evolution has accounted for whole continents going underwater, being wiped out by asteroids. One little tribe in Nova Scotia can re-kickstart the whole world, right? And so that's how I see human beings, as these little civilization seeds. But we live in civilization, so we say, well, I don't have to be Einstein. I don't have to be Yo-Yo Ma. I don't have to be, all these things. I could be normal. And to me, it's a sin against opportunity. It's a sin against your genetics. It's a sin against millions of years of evolution. Shame on you. Aha! I said it.
Yeah, no, it's okay. No, it's okay. I hear that. I still think there's, I still wonder if there's, for each individual person, if there's something not more inherently more primal. I would propose a thought that seems to me to be, at least that shows up in a lot of situations that I observe, is that very deep inherent, and you're saying it with the sheepish thing, that inherent need to belong. Right? Like, if you didn't belong to the, like, as a, say, early primal human, if you didn't belong to the community, you were without shelter, you were without fire, you were without water, maybe you were outside the tribe. So that meant, danger was, so like, this is, people like this do things like this. Okay, so
Right.
I'm a person like this, so I'm going to do these things like this. Which is great, which is community, right? Like that's,
Yeah, it's a
like
positive. It could be a very positive thing. You don't want to act
it
like a
can.
freak and make inappropriate
Yeah,
jokes and upset
yeah,
everybody. So they say, "Hey,
yeah,
dude, you're upsetting everybody. Your jokes are really inappropriate, and you sound like a little freak. So shut up." And that
yeah,
heals society. That you're right. I agree with that.
yeah.
I agree.
And so the balance to that is, as if that's the pendulum, or at least the default setting for a lot of people, is to, conform, fit in,
Mhm.
make it
Mhm.
easy, and really no bad on any of that. Like,
Right.
no bad. But I guess I would say I'm speaking a little more niche to the people that are sitting on the edge saying there could be more. There might be more. What if there was more? That wake up and look outside and have a moment where they remember playing in the field to the kid and all the discovery they did. That their father's tool shed was a wonderland as a kid. That the creek in the backyard was full of mystery and um, biodiversity and like discovery every day, something new, something different.
Right.
That all of that still lives and exists within us. And I will lean back into a little bit of your shame on us. I would say, as a Western society, a little bit shame on us, because we often are not very connected to our privilege, the privilege of life that we're experiencing, the privilege of education, the privilege of, I can flip a switch and have lights and I don't have to use a latrine, and haul my waste, hundreds of kilometers away or wherever, like,
Yeah, we're still bitching about
I,
something like our internet service or whatever. We're still bitching.
right.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so because we have so much privilege,
Mhm.
I think that means we have so much responsibility. And that's just a change in the story. And my friend Harris, he says this oftentimes, that most of the times in the world when we have a problem, it's not, A hates B, or um, you know, uh, climate change isn't being, like, isn't real or is real or whatever, right? We have a story problem. Most of the time, at the very fundamental level, it's a story problem that we don't really aren't telling the story well.
Right.
And there's other people that are trained to tell stories that are telling it better than us.
Right.
Um, and it's changing the way that we experience the world and the way we see things. I will not tell this. I'm gonna tell a story, and I'm not gonna tell it well because it's been a while since I told it. But um, I'm trying to even think what century this was. But for a long period of time, for hundreds and hundreds of years, in China, foot binding by
Mhm.
women was like a common practice, where they would bind their feet up in these tiny little shoes, and it would deform their feet, and they would, walk. But it was like a sign of privilege, and this was done for centuries. And um, I don't remember the girl's name, but a girl from outside China, let's say from Europe, came in, and she spent quite a bit of time in that culture. And then she left and she wrote a book about Chinese foot binding and explaining the practice and what was going on. Nobody knew that this was going on. And because of that book, because of her storytelling, within, I think, a period of like 100 years, the Chinese foot binding has completely left that culture, because people saw that to be cruel and inhumane, and a part of, so we have things as a part of our culture. We need storytellers to rise up. We need people to experiment and come with imagination and see potential in others, and see potential opportunities that others
Oh,
don't see.
maybe it's a lack of faith then, that that your experience, that your life isn't important enough to tell. That because, as I was suggesting, that in the process of reiterating experience in terms of story, even to ourselves, we learn about ourselves and our own, the value of our experience, right? And it might end up getting rid of a horrible practice conducted by a culture against young women, right? But it could be lots of things, right? Like, we have this potentiality as a human being, as an individual, to do perhaps mountainously large things, right? But we might limit ourselves just by not believing that, not thinking that we have a contribution to make. And we ignore, we just put on a shelf our experience and try to find collective experiences we could talk about, like what we saw on Netflix. And we don't, and I don't mean to sound too judgmental, because I watch Netflix too. I'm not trying to sound like I'm a judgmental prick, but what I'm saying is there's this, I hate to see lost opportunity. I hate to see waste. And like you're talking about living in the West, we have a problem with people being gaining weight, not seeing themselves as potential heroes, having a story that's not a story of mission and of their own quest, but of just being a consumer, right? And being too conformist. So it's a matter of, to me, of degrees, not of, damn, these people, they're such asses, but we could do more. We have, like you said, it's noblesse oblige. It's the idea that when you're given this great opportunity, you have more on your table to do. The Spider-Man credo, right?
Yeah. I love that idea that if we could just change the narrative for ourselves.
Yeah.
And really, we've spent a lot of this conversation talking about the way that we see the world outside of us. And really, the bigger conversation is the way we see the world within us. And that conversation,
which is the only real world, right? It's physically speaking, scientifically speaking, there is no really world outside of you you're aware of. It's all you're an electronic system, and you're interpreting data that comes into your eye, but you don't. It's all data, right? I'm just being very literal here.
No, you're right.
We've constructed a world we think is real, and it's good enough that we don't get hit by cars and don't bump into trees, but it's not that much better than that. We're pretty crude. We have to create a little Disney world inside of our head to make it all make sense. But the world's a lot more complicated than that, isn't it?
It is, and our internal world is the most mysterious hidden world.
Yeah,
it's the world that others don't see very often. And I think that is, if I could wave a wand and fix one thing in the world, and there's lots of things to fix, so I would be asking for more wishes, right? I guess that's against the laws or against the rules of wand waving. You only get so many wishes. You can't wish for more wishes. But it would be that people would have someone to process what's going on, someone safe to process what's going on up here, someone that can listen and help them explore. Because a lot of times people can find the solutions for themselves. They just never heard them say it out loud. They've never heard themselves bring to the verbal or to the paper their inner world. And actually, psychologically, as we do that, we actually release our grip on it, because a lot of those stories that we're telling ourselves, like, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, or my teacher told me this when I was a kid, or my boss thinks I'm dumb, there might be a little bit of fact in there, but that is a lot of fiction wrapped up. Because of the way our brain works, we make a decision about something. I decide that I'm not good at basketball. I'm just not good at basketball. And then our brain, instead of going out in a very scientific way, going out trying to prove that statement wrong, it actually goes out and looks for all the evidence for why it's right. So our brains aren't very scientific for most of us. Like, you can train it to do that, but it's not very natural for most people. And so we go out and try to find evidence to back it up, to make it make sense, to make that world make sense. But we're never talking through the evidence with people very often, or we don't feel like we have someone safe to talk through that evidence with. And a lot of times, if you have someone that's like, at least can slow down enough to listen to you, can hear your thinking, or you can even hear your own thinking as it comes out your mouth, and you're like, did I just say that? I'll give another tool that I use a lot with clients. And my friend Jillian taught me this, and she's a master coach in my world. She's done a lot of amazing things, but her biggest thing was she was her name's Jillian Farabee, and maybe we can put a link to some of the work she's doing.
Great.
She runs a coaching firm called Kite Parade. She's out of Canada, but for 12 years, 13 years, something like that, she was the casting director for Cirque du Soleil. So she worked with a lot of high performers, and she's a master at imagination and innovation and play, and how to loosen our mind up to find new possibilities. Right. And one of the tools that she taught me is this idea of like exploring other truths. And it's just 2 little phrases that can be repeated in a cycle. And yes, you can do this with yourself, but it's really hard to do brain surgery on yourself. And that's really what you're doing when you're evaluating your psychology and seeing if it could be a little more flexible, if there was more possibility with that conversation that's going on inside your mind. So give me something right now, Mike, that you would say is like a catch-22 for you, that just feels stupidly impossible. It's not working, or maybe it's just like a frustration that's repetitive.
Oh, Jesus.
Could be anything.
Yeah. Well, okay. Like, it had been for a while, like, losing weight. Okay. It was a bugaboo for me. It was like losing weight. And I was trying to mentally make myself say, well, I'm going to cut down my portions and Then my wife would make this amazing, Mexican casserole, and I'd half a casserole dish of it with sour cream, and I'd blow that out of the water. So, that was it. And I found that now I'm doing the 16-hour fast, because I like that because I can look at the clock. It's very scientific. I could just hit the stopwatch, say I can't eat until 12 o'clock tomorrow or whatever it's going to be, right? And so that's been a perennial problem. And now that I'm getting older, I'm 56 now, and things are changing on me. So I have to be more militant about it, right? About keeping my muscle mass up. Worried about my flesh suit here. So that's been a kind of perennial, or I don't know how you call it, but does that answer your question? You were trying to look at that's something kind of personal, but probably relates to a lot of people out there.
Yeah, it's really good. So what would you say is the most simplified version of like a very common little catch-22 about it? Catch-22 being like, I want it to be this way, but this thing always gets in the way.
Yeah, my brain.
That's kind of like,
yeah, like I'll say in the morning, but before I did the time thing, right, where I wouldn't allow myself absolutely to eat. If I said it was just a portion thing, like, I would say in the morning before I got out of bed, this is what I'm going to do. I get up and do the opposite, and just put a ton of sugar and milk in my coffee, and eat a lot of carbs and do all the delicious things I want to do, because it's all delicious goodness. And I blow myself off. So I had 2 selves. I was blowing my other self off, and it kind of, I think, irritated me, right? But I get out my day and forget about it. But it will catch up to you, right? When you feel uncomfortable and you're winded, and all these things happen when you get fat. So yeah. So it's my playing mind games with myself. It got old, and I was like, finally, I'm just gonna I'm gonna go by the clock, and put myself on the clock, and I'm gonna start weighing myself and being aware of how heavy I am, things like that.
So I'm gonna dive in a little deeper, because I'm trying to get to a specific problem here.
Yeah.
What do you think was when it came to like, let's say I've made a decision for the morning, and then it changes. What do you think was the problem in there?
That my gut won. I mean, I think it's the biological versus it's the brain versus the body, in a sense, right? When it comes to exercise, we tend to be entropic beings, in a sense. We want to go towards the couch. We want to go towards sloth. We want to go towards hedonism and the flesh, and just enjoy ourselves. It's a pleasure principle. But the road to increasing your muscle mass and losing your fat density, your body density, all that stuff, that is not the pleasure principle. It's a more deferred pleasure. It's more putting off pleasure for future gain. And that takes a different kind of energy, a different kind of discipline. That's how I
Okay.
see it. That's how I see
Yeah,
it.
that's good. So I heard something in there and you said my gut won.
Yeah.
My gut won. Okay.
I
So
call it that, but whatever that
yeah,
pleasure principle is, right?
yeah. So I'll use that. And actually your example here is probably there would be some other tools that I would use to kind of like unpack some of this. And pleasure is like a very interesting, and dopamine and all that stuff. So we're actually talking about brain chemistry here as well.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So this is a little bit different than maybe I would use this specific tool. So I'm gonna hone in on one thing and see if we can't play with it, so I can let people experience the tool and how it would work.
Mm-hmm.
So you said my gut won, and so here's part one of the tool. Do you know that to be true?
Well,
that your gut won?
No, I'm telling you a story about how I saw it, right? And I just made that story up because I haven't really thought about it. So I don't know if it's just I just told you a story about my situation.
Yeah. Well, and so so the second part of the tool is what else could be true about this?
Well, there's a lot to all this, isn't there? Because you could avoid how you see yourself. You could look in the mirror and look straight on and see a silhouette that's okay. But then you can see a picture somebody took of you on vacation and you want to throw up because you're like, oh God, in profile, I'm a disgusting elephant. So just being aware of your three-dimensional being is interesting to me, because I found that the more I was aware of my three-dimensional being, the more I was disgusted and I had a kind of shame and I wanted to change it. So it kind of ebbed up to more of an executive functioning. And I said, I know what I need to do. And that is to fast, to literally not let myself eat anything for 16 hours a day. Because I know I can do that. I've done it in the past and I know I can do that. There's a track record with that, but I've never had a track record of living a balanced life. I've never been able to do that. Where I could just moderate my eating, eat a Mediterranean diet, go on walks, do a little weightlifting. I'm a former football player. I know how it goes. I got to be kind of militant to make things happen. This is how my brain works. I might be wrong. That's how I interpret myself.
No, this is good. This is good. So I'm going to plug into another little part of that, because I heard this language earlier. So, and again, this tool isn't I got you. Right. And specifically isn't like to find something wrong, bad, or broken.
Right.
But you said twice now, I've heard you say that I have to be militant.
Yeah.
Or it was something that sounds like that.
Yeah.
To be able to get myself in order. I've like I was a football player. This is like I have to be this is how I have to go. Do you know this to be true?
No,
that you have to be militant.
No, I don't know that it's the only way. It's a way that I know that's worked in the past. When I've gone into training, right, then I'm in that mode and I understand that mode, and it puts a world of context around it. I'm in training. I would jokingly call it spring training. Like I gotta get rid of my winter fat. I'm gonna go into spring training. If I'm in training, I know what I have to do. It's a mission, right? It has parameters. I get that. But when it's just life is life, well, shit, I just start drinking beer and eating pizza and I become a disgusting pig. So it's like you're either in training or you're out of training. That's how I kind of see it. I know it's a simplification. I know that life is more nuanced than that, but it seems to be a system that kind of works for me. And I've been a yo-yo. I've been heavy and I've been thin. So I haven't perfected this by any means, but I know it's generally hard for most people. So I don't feel that bad about it. I just know, I'm just giving you an example. You wanted an example.
No, this is good. This is really good. So the next step would be to repeat the phrase. And I do this to myself. Again, it takes some training to be able to do it to yourself. It's better if someone does it to you, does it with you. But the next phrase would be, what else could be true about this? And as you start to see that, like, I might be holding on to a way that it needs to go for it to work, for it to go a certain way. And maybe I could find other resources. And the other great part of this, do you know this to be true? Is there anything else that could be true? That tool is actually it relies less on advice and more on the person who is like going through this construct of discovery for themselves, for them to find the resources, for them to find the answers. And it's super encouraging for them to be like, oh, I mean, I just did this with a client the other day, and there was a specific problem at work. And they said, well, it seems like all the people above me, all of the shareholders, aren't interested in this project. And I asked her, I said, do you know this to be true? And she's like, well, actually, I don't. I said, what else could be true about this? She's like, well, I maybe there's more information that, my boss needs to, get above to the shareholders. Like, do you know this to be true? Well, no, I don't actually know this to be true. What else could be true about this? Well, I could just take the initiative and get all this information to the shareholders that actually might make them care, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, all this possibility that had been just hidden right in plain sight became available out of nowhere. It's all right there. But again, we become so tunnel vision in the story. And her story in that situation was the shareholders don't care. They don't care about this project. They don't care enough to know about it. But she didn't have enough information to really know that. But because we're a narrative machine, we take a little bit of fact. Fact was she wasn't hearing anything. That's true. We do know that true. She wasn't hearing anything. And then we extrapolate out this big story about all this stuff. And usually it has to do with our identity, on how like we're not good enough, fast enough, smart enough, right? And that's all those internal conversations that the unspoken, we generally don't expose to very many people.
Yeah, well, I'm exposing something very personal in this podcast with you, but I don't think that being a former athlete, and I understand that it's really important to like come out and talk about these things. It helps you actually get thinner. Is if you talk about how, if you admit that you're fatter than you want to be, it's a fast way to get thinner, obviously, for me. And but yeah, I think there's a level of in my worldview of I don't want to sound mean, but I do believe that healthy people aren't morbidly obese, right? Healthy people tend to find a weight that they can be physically active without causing injury, that they can do things without being out of breath, that there is a healthy weight to be at, and there's a healthy amount of body mass, of weight mass to have at a certain age.
Yeah.
So I think there's science behind it. So I don't think I'm under some kind of Instagram nightmare of being body shamed and all kind of crap. I think that I do think that women find a certain physique attractive. I can see Brad Pitt's body being kind of idealistic in a sense, And so if I can move a little bit closer to that and a little farther away from the guy from Family Guy, I'll be happy with that. You know what I mean? So yeah. But I don't think my story is self-delusion. I don't think I'm under some kind of delusion about myself. I'm trying not to be anyways.
Well, one thing it seems like I hear in there is actually some health around the idea that this is more about me being able to move and function.
Oh, absolutely. Right? Being
where
healthy.
A lot of the psychology behind it. And I would say I have the weird opposite. I've always been a very I guess skinny guy. And there is skinny shaming. I don't know if some people don't know that exists, but it does.
I have skinny envy. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there is skinny shaming too. Why don't you have another burger? You need to put some meat on the bones, right? Like, those are all language that you start to like get this idea. Story begins to form in your head that something's wrong with you.
Right.
And I think health in our at least especially here in the Western world, there are so many narratives going on within one person's mind, whether it's what the mirror is reflecting, what they've heard, it's so complicated.
Right.
And then you throw in the fact that we have biochemistry, gut chemistry, that's saying, you want this, you need this. You're like, why did I have a third cup of coffee this afternoon? I don't know, like, right? Like it's very hard to unwire some things, and it takes
Absolutely.
time and
Yeah.
consistency, showing up again and again and again, little bit by bit. And for a lot of us, and this goes back to storytelling too.
Mhm.
So we think that we're going to unwrite a story in a moment's time, and it could happen. It could happen. I mean, think about JFK saying we're going to the moon. In a moment's time, a whole new story was born. But you look at that story of Chinese foot binding. It took 100 years for that story to circulate and unwire
Right.
a whole. So our psychology, it might not be instantaneous. It may take a lot of little 1% baby, 0.5% baby steps of
Right.
time.
But there are zeitgeists, there are time ghosts, and I think like a Tesla, I'm not Tesla, I'm sorry, Elon Musk is someone who is pretty aware of the time ghost. He knows that there was a pent up army of legion of people out there who wanted to go and be spacefaring people. He just knew it.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't, he knew it just had a little tipping point. Like, I'm going to go to Mars. I'm going to do it. And he knew he'd have legions of people that would love him for saying it, because you have generations of Star Trek, and people just want to go to space, so it's a no brainer in a lot of ways. And the Kennedy was the same way. He said, I'm going to give us permission to try to do this before the century is out of going to the moon. He threw his head over the wall, and it was hard. So, and I'm a big believer in that kind of thinking of like, let's set ourselves an impossible goal and just stick to it and see what happens. Because even if we don't make it, we're going to make a lot more progress than we would have had if we had a low imagination, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And how much of that like pressure or that someone paving the way, or someone at least cutting a path for us, opens our psychology, changes our narrative about what's possible. Elon Musk saying, hey, we're going to go, changes the narrative. Right.
Well, and there's studies that proven that they did a study with I think it was kindergarten kids, but and you probably heard this one, where they told the kids, they gave them a test and told them that they were underachievers, that they had low IQs, and these kids universally all performed terribly. And the opposite was true. The kids who performed high performed great, but the test was fake. It was random. So the placebo is massive. If I tell a child they're an astronaut and they're going to be living in space, and that the Earth is kind of like a spaceship, and that food is a biochemical process that they can control. We can have hydroponic gardens in the school, and a school is a laboratory for future space colonies. The kids are there. They're already out in space. They're there. But what we do is we take the metaphor of the school and we turn it into a freaking prison. The metaphor of the school is so sick and wrong in so many ways that a lot of kids sense it, and they're like, I hate going to school, because what they're saying is, I hate going to prison. It's a day prison for working parents and for their kids. So I think that it wouldn't take much money to shift the narrative a little bit and make a school a source of adventure in a community, right? That's massive. And to insist the kids tell stories every day. It wouldn't take any money to have kids tell stories.
So as that's a big change, and that may be like I was explaining, like it may take 10, 15, 20, 30 years. It may happen in a moment, but it may take years for that change. How can, and I'm throwing a question your way, how can we as people that care about the potential, we all care about the potential of our kids,
right?
That really truly care about the potential of our kids and the possibility for them to like do really amazing things, solve really interesting problems, open up exploration that we've never imagined, whether that's space and reality, whatever that may be. What can parents start to do at home? Because that's where I go, like, what's school for? And I get that we have we could talk for hours about what's school for and why is it working and not working. But I'd ask the question, okay, so if that's not working right now, what do we have control over as parents? So then what is parenting for?
Okay, you would be very open with your kids and honest and say, listen, this teacher's doing the best job they can, schools are doing the best job they can, and we're doing the best job we can, and you need to do the best job you can as a kid. Okay. The minute you wake up in the morning, and even when you were asleep, you were learning until you go to bed at night. And still when you're dreaming, you're learning, right? You're always learning. You're always kind of in a school. We call it building a school, but really schooling is your whole life. You're always learning. Mm-hmm. So if you, so you need to be, it's not our job to be disappointed in you. Okay. We act disappointed when we think that you probably could have done better. So what you're doing, you're setting your kid up to kind of own the process more, right?
Yeah.
And then let them know, come to us if you want something. If you're interested in plants, we'll help you set up a garden. If you're interested in animals, maybe we can't have a monkey in the house, but maybe we could set up a terrarium and you could have a little gecko or a hermit crab. Would you like a hermit crab? You know, I got a hermit crab when I was a kid. It made my whole year. So there are things parents can do to support the school and vice versa, to say this kid is a project. He's an evolutionary billion-year in the making project. Treat him like it, treat her like it, and see what happens, because I think almost guarantee you they'll step up in some way. And they might say a silly thing like, I want to be a YouTube star, but it's not that silly actually. Say, okay,
Yeah.
well, maybe we need to learn about sound design and we'll learn about photography. Let's find some free software at first, and maybe we'll use your iPhone or use a tablet. Take them seriously. They might fall off that one and move away from it, but treat them seriously in that sense and treat their play life seriously. And you're going to get massive results that won't cost a ton of money, you know, especially the other outcome is you blow them off your whole life and then they're 18 and they're completely useless and they don't believe in themselves. Right. So yeah, that's my advice.
Wow. That's really good. There's like you dropped some gems in there. And I think one of those huge things was, and this is what it sounded like, was creating space for failure.
Oh yeah. Oh
creating
yeah.
Space.
Yeah.
Space that
fiascos aren't bad things, you know, they're not necessarily.
Yeah. I would say a lot of the adults I work with today, C-suite and C-suite down to, you know, entry level, just out of college, they're so afraid to fail.
Failure reverse is a road to mediocrity and ruin. It really is. It's not the road to innovation.
I actually don't blame them, because it seems to me that everything
they're taught that
around them has been set up to create the result that we're getting.
Yeah.
You know, like the system was designed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, to get the result we're getting. Kind of we're living in a post-industrial age, but the industrial age was to make compliant kids.
Right.
That would pull lever A when lever A was asked to be pulled. And now, you know, that world has moved. We don't live in that industrial age anymore. And we really need, we need creative problem solvers and people that can show up in a space and say, this might be the stupidest idea you've ever heard, but I'm going to throw it out because it may just be the building block for something amazing.
Right. We're really good at being performing monkeys. We're excellent at being performing monkeys. There's no doubt about it. And some people are like amazing performing monkeys. Okay. And there's a place for that. There's a place for being a performing primate. Because but no kidding, we get ace being primate. We're the apex primate. We should do that, right? But you're saying there's something unique about human beings, that we're storytellers, that we could abstract ourselves from ourselves. We could abstract a process, and we could look at failure as a road to discovery. Okay, and we have to. And sometimes it's good to look at a hero like an Edison and say, he talked about how every failure was a road towards a discovery. And having the kids own the process.
That would be the other great thing is that, you know, we look forward so much. And I know for myself, I'm, you know, as my kids are starting to get to the age where they're reading, there's certain literature that, like, I know the school will have them read. But there is certain literature that I am going to propose that they read. You know, I want them to read and understand how, you know, the beginning of the genetic genome was being discovered. And I want them to understand, I want them to learn about Edison and how he thought, you know, like, I mean, any of Walter Isaacson's books are phenomenal, but for them to look at history too and see that, you know, there are amazing mentors who don't live anymore.
Right.
They're right at your fingertips. Their wisdom, their approach, the way they saw the world, the way they saw and I'll be honest with you, it's a little bit of a gift, because as we may say, well, that's kind of naive because the world was simpler back then. The world was simpler back then in a good way.
Yep.
And they had less things, less noise, less interference going on in their mind
Right.
than we're the most interfered generation there's ever been.
Right.
And so to be able to look at them, people that actually had ability to slow down and take a long walk through the woods and really find the solution, to spend time with themselves alone and think through some things, and then come back and say, aha, I have an option. Let's try this again.
Hey, Nick, I'm gonna be, I have to go out the room 1 second. Okay. Hold on. Dead airspace. You want to keep talking. Okay. I'll be right back.
You're good. You're good. Sometimes I wonder what, Mike's camera's out of focus back there. So I'm like, what are all of those Lux Blocks models going on the background back there? See, this is how wonder works for me. It is looking into and showing up to any space with curiosity. And that is like, that's a skill that can be learned. Anybody can learn how to do that. That is not just a random gift that some people are bestowed the ability to see and have wonder. Any of us can learn that. Seth Godin says that any action, any behavior could be a skill that could be learned. And I think a lot of us, we need that ability to see what we don't see. I was talking to people for a minute about wonder, and I was explaining how as soon as you left, my wonder gear kicked in, and I started looking at the back of your desk and started wondering why this one is there and how this one works. And then I shared this idea, this concept that no one is just, yes, some people may naturally have certain talents, but a lot of the things that we have in life are skills that are practiced and learned. And wonder, the ability to slow down and ask really juvenile questions, very stupid questions, to ask the stupidest question in the room, is a skill that can be learned.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
If anything, it's actually an unlearning. It's
actually an easy skill to learn. Just start saying stupid shit. It's throwing spaghetti on the wall. Einstein did it. A lot of great thinkers did it. They elevated it to the art of thought experiments, is what they would call it. Thought experiments. But it's like the clay of the brain, right? You can just play with it. So let's take reality and play with it and make a ridiculous story about a flat universe, and it's totally flat and people live in flat land, right? And you could imagine that, right? But you do that so you can talk about the third dimension and maybe a fourth dimension, right? So we've discussed this before about saying apparently stupid things. Like Bucky Fuller would say he'd ask people how heavy their houses are. Or Elon Musk would say, why are rocket engines so expensive? And everyone's assumed, well, because they're rocket engines, right? But he'd say, but if you look at the constituent parts of like the metals and look at the London Metal Exchange, it shouldn't be that expensive, right? So why are they so expensive? And why do we have to always throw them away? Every time we use them, we just throw the rocket away. We just pitch it, we chuck it.
Yeah.
Why can't the rocket land again? So Tesla, not Tesla, you call him Tesla, Musk, their model is they keep testing lots of rockets and they keep cataloging failures. So the first 14 rockets landed and exploded, right? And people are like, oh, his rockets are all exploding. He's learning more when the rocket fails.
Yeah.
So that's why they're innovating so fast.
Yeah. So I kind of equate this idea of mental resiliency, mental flexibility, wonder. All of them kind of play in the same space of, it's not necessarily being childish, it's being childlike. And this ability to not assume anything's obvious, that there may be more going on underneath the surface. And that is all, again, a storytelling problem in our own brain. And really brings us back to the top of our conversation about this idea that we are a narrative machine, that we're looking for what we're looking for.
Right. And this, let me tell you one story real quick that relates back to this, because why are we here? Why are we talking like this? And it happens in a couple of people I've interviewed before, educators, it comes up, especially the one I did with Christoph, the Hungarian in Finland, the educator. But there is a tradition to education, right? And it goes back to the Romans and the Greeks and all that. But in the Middle Ages, scholasticism became predominant.
Yes.
So basically, kids were these empty vessels. You'd go, if you were lucky enough to go to a school, you'd basically be, the knowledge would be poured into your ear, and you have to recite back in Latin or Greek, all the wisdom of the ages, right? Mechanical monkeys again. And so any storytelling was happening with stories being told to you, right? Not the other way around. And you were treated as basically a kind of a primitive little humanoid until you became a professor. And it was the progressives, it was the Pestalozzi's and the Montessoris, and the Froebels, who invented kindergarten, who said, who believed Rousseau, when Rousseau, the great romantic, said that children are these vast potentialities. Okay, and I don't agree with a lot of Rousseau. I think Rousseau's a lot of the problems of the world were because of Rousseau, like the French Revolution and the other revolutions following were based on Rousseau's incorrect view of humanity. But one correct view of humanity he had was, when he wrote Emile, was the idea that children are these vast potentialities, and you don't want to waste the opportunity early on to get on the right track with kids. Okay, and that is to treat them like they have this potential. And so you had this progressive school of education, okay, that I think was dead right. And we're still living, you and I, in this battle zone, whether you're aware of it or not. There's still a battle going on about how we educate children. Should they learn what's in the stuff we're going to test them on? It's a current debate. How do we treat children? And you talk about skills and all that stuff. It seems logical. Both sides seem right. Well, we don't want to not teach kids things. We don't want to unschool them, because that sounds like malpractice. But we don't also want to abuse them the idea that they're educatable, that school's a horrible place. We don't want them to believe that either. So what's the middle ground? And I don't think it's an easy answer. I really don't. I used to think it was easy, but I don't think it's easy.
Yeah. Well, that's I think another interesting thing. I mentioned this before, that I would categorize myself as a recovering irrational optimist. I'm becoming more and more rational with my optimism as I've gotten older, and I think that's fairly easy for anyone to do, is to want to again, it comes back to the brain's ability to want to conserve energy. We just want to simplify the answer, get us the simplest version. And again, I know that some personalities really want all the detail, and that's totally great too. But for a lot of us, we tend to run towards simplify. I just need to move on to the next thing. And so again, I don't think the answer, the solution is simple. I don't think that anything like we're talking about this morning is simple. But the real question is it valuable? Is it worth it? If you had to evaluate, do nothing or leave status quo in place, or for us to keep having these conversations, to take a step forward, to do something, to do the work you're doing, to work in schools and to find a side door into the educational system, a window into the educational system, to where you can interject opportunities to think and see, become critical thinkers, critical problem solvers, to say that just because you clicked it together that way, it's not failure, it's discovery.
Right.
But again, this all comes back to our stories we tell ourselves. I mean, are the stories we tell ourselves determine our reality? They are the power broker in our lives, and they're the voice that no one else hears. Right. And how well, how often and how well we revisit that tone and that content that's going on in that private voice will determine the quality of our life.
Yeah, and sometimes we tell ourselves the wrong fable. Like, I'll give you a fable. There's the liberal and there's the conservative, right? And there's the messed up world they live in, and each one blames the other for why the world is messed up, right? And there's a third person who says, I'm both. And you say, well, that's impossible. No, he's, why is it impossible? He goes, I want to preserve what's good, and I want to fix what's not good. I'm a liberal and I'm a conservative. And both the liberal and conservative scratch their heads and say, but you can't, is that allowed? You know, and he's like, well, sure, because I'm a human being, and therefore nothing is alien to me that's human, right? I accept the liberal because I think that some things should be fixed, and I accept the conservative that some things are too good to throw away. Yeah. And the process is discernment. It's discernment, and we can both talk about discernment because we're both discerning creatures. So you can create a conversation in the middle. Like, let's not demonize each other. Let's say we're all part of a story, and you tend to be one that wants to change shit, and you tend to be one that wants to protect stuff, right? But I think we could talk, right? That's how I see it.
Yeah, that there's a common ground, and I'll bring up Jillian's name again. A phrase I've heard her use quite a bit. There's a third way, right? Mm-hmm. That we could be more committed to us finding a solution, even though it might not seem possible in the moment.
Right.
That we could find a solution that you get what you feel like is necessary, and I get what I feel like is necessary at some level. That there's a third way. And there's stories all over the world of people brokering the most horrendous, it seems like you're giving up so much to get these two worlds to come together, but they're thinking about the long tail, not the short head. They're thinking about, how does this play out 100 years from now instead of right here in this moment? And I think, again, this is something that I've been running through my brain recently, is that it seems to me that we're not really able to tell time very well. We're very short-sighted. We don't think in like that things will take as long as they may need to, right. And we want things to happen so quickly. A great example is like, it's very easy for me to see from my clients, oh, here's the steps you should take to get to where you want to go. But that never is the answer, ever. But even I could say like, oh, that you could get there in 3 weeks, 3 months, 2 months, and then to watch a year's time span go by, to be with a client for a year and watch what they achieve in a year and be blown away because you could have never imagined it to be that much, or that, like, it's way beyond what you could ever imagine. But again, we become very much like the short, how can we get the quickest version answer right now, instead of slowing down and saying, you know what, the solution to education, it might take 20 years. It might take 50 years. So how do we pick one thing and start now?
Yeah, and I'd also say there's a power in the little book. Like, I often ask people, I'll say, tell me what your ideal school looks like. Just tell me what it looks like. What would it be like to walk into school? What does it smell like? What are the kids doing? Because that process of telling me that story about what that's like Rousseau writing a meal, right? It's kind of like almost like science fiction. Like, that's why people love Star Trek so much. They let themselves believe that, they forget about this world and say, in the future, everything's freaking awesome. And in small group classrooms on a starship, and you could go into this machine and you could do anything you want. So they allow them, science fiction allows you to kind of imagine a completely new world, right? And you can put all your idealism you want into it and all your nightmares. So I ask people, like, tell me, instead of us arguing about what we don't want, tell me what you want. What's your ideal world look like? Because I might actually dig your world, even though right now I can't stand your face, right?
Wow.
So it's creative.
Yeah.
I think people should be creative.
Yeah, I like that. Well, again, you're helping them expose the unspoken.
Yeah.
Right. And I use this term. I don't know if I used this earlier, but there's a term that Jacqueline Novogratz uses in her work and in her book, a manifesto for a moral revolution. I think everyone should check out. More people need to know about her and the work that she's doing all over the world. I think if anybody has the street creds to say what she's saying, she's the person.
Mm.
But yeah, Acumen is the company that she leads, founded and leads, and they do a lot of work setting up and investing in entrepreneurs all over the world in the most craziest communities and situations. A lot of micro, long-term investing, really getting behind people. But she's sat in the midst of some of the craziest stories. She's a great storyteller, by the way. In her book, she tells a lot of great stories. But this term that she uses is this idea of moral imagination, the ability to imagine that there may be more in common, more going on that I need to know about. And I know this keeps coming up in our conversation this morning, in the person across the table from me. I don't know their history. I don't know what happened to them and why they think the way they think. And they actually might be a person that I need to know. I need to know better, because if we're going to work together, I need to have what I think, if anybody that studies communication and organizational development, a lot of people have read Google's, Google did a study, Project Aristotle, and they try to figure out like what makes the best team. And I'll drill it down. It's trust, right? Vulnerability is kind of the leads to the trust, but it's trust. It's trust amongst the team. Doesn't matter how you could put the group of the most high performers in a team, and they just flunk out. Basically, there's all kinds of weird stuff starts happening. But if a team, didn't matter who was on the team, how educated, how smart, what discipline, if they could build trust, they could almost solve any problem. And that trust comes from vulnerability, from you seeing me in a way that I see myself. Right now, you see me as the little bit of version you know about me, but you can't see me as I see myself. But the more and more we get to know each other, the more and more I tell stories about growing up with my family in Wisconsin, and you tell stories about growing up, and what your dad went through, being working as a caddy, and how that ultimately shaped some of the stories he told himself. All of a sudden, your vulnerability invites me to be vulnerable, which builds trust between each other, because now I see you. And this idea of seeing the other person, not just who they are in the moment, but who they were, who they are now, and who they would be in the future, their ancestry, and also all of their legacy to come, to be able to hold space for that in a moment. It takes a lot of work to get there, but that's really what we need to be able to solve problems, is to be able to hear.
So you're thinking
more than just what we want.
So we need to be the Nabu in the movie Avatar and walk around saying, "I see you."
Yeah,
I see you. I'm just joking, but that's what they said. No. And it was interesting. And one of my favorite parts of that movie was the fact that they said that, because they gave a big joke, like a meme, like "I see you, us." But being able to see is actually a really big deal. We call our toy Lux because it means light, and shedding light on something, seeing something. It goes deep, like storytelling goes deep, perception, right? And seeing the person sitting across from you is actually a profound thing. It's not who you think they are, but seeing the actual coalescence of all the stories and the motivations and the reasons why they act the way they do. Not just your judgment of who they are, but you're seeing where it's all coming from, and you become empathetic, right? You develop empathy for that person, and you become bonded. Yeah. You become bonded with them because you're vulnerable. You're saying,
yeah. Well, there's that. I think that term, "I see you." It's interesting. I don't remember that now, but this goes back to this idea of like, when we start to build new lenses, we see things that we normally didn't see before. Right. How important that is. And for a while now, I've heard read quite a few studies around different languages, different cultures. I was going to talk about maybe this morning, but I think we ran out of time here. But there's a person that's doing, and I'll send it to you, Mike. I can't remember her name, but I've started reading some of her work, and she has a book that's coming out, and it's called I think it's like 10,000 or 7,000 universes. It's the idea that everyone's language creates a different universe. And she's like a neuroscientist, PhD. She spent time in all these different cultures all over the world. And for example,
Yeah, what does it mean when it says, what does the universe mean for her? If it's a universe, if a person develops the universe, what does that mean?
means that language is the key to how we see things. So
So,
how we
okay.
perceive things. So everything is because it's really the only tool we have to define stuff, whether that's internally or in language could. And so every language has its own unique phrases and potential. So for example, if I were to knock over the lamp on your desk behind you, I'd be like, hey, Mike, I'm sorry I broke this. But in other languages, like in Spanish, the term is it broke. So there's a different framing of the responsibility of what happened in that moment. And so she studied all these different languages and all these different cultures in the world, and has come to the realization that we really have so many different perspectives on what makes our world the world, and how we understand that for people, like the way you experience the world. It's probably more than 7,000, because you have different meaning that you put on language than I do, is by listening, is by slowing down to understanding and double clicking on those words to understand, what does it mean for this one word for you? What does
Yeah.
fun mean? What does education mean? Right? Understanding that has a world behind it for you, different than me.
Yeah. And it's
All,
not easy. Some people I've actually not interviewed. I've actually pre-interviewed somebody who we mutually rejected for being on the show. She rejected me and I rejected her because I just couldn't. All I could say was right, right. She was saying things I couldn't get my head around. I just could not. And so I was like, but this isn't going to work because this person is I felt like I was inadequate. Essentially, in the end, I felt like I was inadequate because I couldn't even begin to like dig down into her language, because I felt like all her assumptions were things that I found abhorrent. And I said, I don't even want to dig there, and that's my problem, not hers. But so I don't think it's always easy to communicate with people. I think sometimes you have to really do a lot of pushing away of your emotions and become more like Spock, I guess, because sometimes I find it hard to talk to certain people, especially if you're whipped up about something. I'll give you a good example. If somebody I'll give you an example. Someone I know gets their news from like one news source, and the other person, maybe their sister, gets this from another news source, and they both feel like the point of the conversation is to impart this really important news. Maybe it's about COVID, right? And vaccination. And the other person gets their news from a completely different news source, right? And they have completely different worldviews. And each one feels beholden that they're only going to succeed if they persuade that person of their point of view, when that means utter defeat for that person. So it's a freaking brick wall. And it's a horrible thing to watch. It really is. It's upsetting. And I might sympathize with one or both parties, but the situation's bad. And I see it happening a lot. So, and I think probably a lot of people do.
I think if there was one like little nugget or gift that I could leave this morning with, would be this idea that we believe that meaning resides in the speaker. That I am, as I'm sharing with you as a speaker, that I'm defining it clear enough to you. You know what I mean, right? Like that's why I say right, or do you understand? Does that make sense to you? We assume that the meaning resides there. Actually, meaning resides in the listener. And so if that's true in a conversation, the listener's perceiving and listening, and they're not just listening through their ears, they're also could be listening through status, through I don't want to get this wrong. All kinds of stories could be going on as they're listening, little bitty filters, right? As they're listening. So they're not like purely like unfiltered listening either. But that if that's true, if we could say, oh, that's true, that meaning resides in the listener, then it is on some part the responsibility of both the listener and the speaker to understand that they have responsibility to make sure that the meaning is clear.
You're basically saying that, like my example, for instance, they had not established the right ground rules for the conversation. You're saying establish the ground rules. You both have a responsibility to listen to each other and listen for meaning, and not just wait for the other person to stop talking so you can talk at them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
Big difference.
Yeah. I think what it is, it's been a while since I've looked at this number, but I think it's like every 13, 16 seconds, our brain goes into like daydreaming. Like when we're not held in like attention, our attention drifts really quickly. And that's all variant on cognitive load and how much caffeine we've had, or how much water we've had to drink, or if we're under stress, that can all vary, right? So if that's true, so we're already, the meaning's on us. We're already probably listening to respond, not actually listening to listen. Right. Ready to make our point. And not only that, we're probably leaving the conversation every 13 seconds to daydream about the project we're thinking about, or what we're making for dinner, or whatever. So if all that's true, that means that we have more responsibility to show up the conversation saying, this is probably going to be distracted. This is going to be like irrational at some point. This like, I'm not going to be thinking clearly, probably. So I need, as a responsible human, to ask a lot of questions. A lot more questions than have answers.
And it's so much easier just to say, that person's just been brainwashed into a cult, and throw up your hands. And I think I see that a lot too. And I think it's a lazy way of just giving up. But
I would say it's an irresponsible way of giving up.
Yeah.
Because now there's no future.
Yep. None.
Well, actually, there's a future. It's just a default future. It's just the label you put together.
Right.
Said this is the only way they can be, and that's the only way you will see them.
Yeah.
You won't look for you won't have moral imagination. You won't be able to look for another option.
Right. It's a failure of moral imagination. I like that. Failure of a moral imagination. I think that we could flesh that out in a different show if we wanted to. I think it's a lot to
I think I would maybe you should read Jacqueline's book. Again, that's a manifesto for a moral revolution. I would say I've spent a lot of time in third world developing countries. I've trained a lot of people to be in third world developing countries. And I thought I understood how to think about my privilege, my identity, and how that relates to others, maybe lack of privilege, or their way they see and experience the world. This book shook me to the core. The way I thought I was a good listener, the way I thought I was understanding the problems, or I thought I had solutions. I mean, I haven't read a book, Mike, in probably 10 years.
Right.
That hasn't shooken me to the core. And there's a great interview with her and Tim Ferriss. That's a great introduction to her work that she's doing and the way that she sees the world. I would consider her like the Mother Teresa of microeconomics.
Interesting.
I mean, she's a economics by training.
Right.
And
send me the link. We'll put the link. We'll put the links below in both the Facebook and the YouTube, eventual YouTube. And Nick, as always, we went deep, and
it started deep, and then it went deeper.
And I never know where it's going to go with you. And I appreciate you coming on. And please, I will read these books, and maybe you'll come back on this fall or winter, and we'll start where we left off. How's that?
Would love it. And I'll come up and build sometime with you.
Great. That sounds perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us off Facebook now. Okay. So hold on a second. I'm ending that. Oh, wait, no, I'm not going to hold on. Stop live stream. Okay. Now we're just on Zoom.
Yeah.
So thanks, man. That was awesome.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I felt like you were clear.
No, I felt like, oh man, did he notice that I was drifting off there for a second?
No, that's okay. Hopefully it was clear and it wasn't too deep or too. It's not
an easy thing to talk about. It really isn't.
No, there's so much to it, and one of the things that I work on is slowing down and not trying to feel like I need to I like sometimes I just wish we had the neuro link, and I could just go boop, and you'd be like, I get it.
Did you hear the Rogan and Elon Musk interview about that, about Neuralink?
No, I need to listen to it.
Oh my God, he talked about that, how once we have Neuralink, we won't need language.
Yeah.
And he says language is so inferior. But Rogan was like, yeah, but I like hearing bad language. I like to hear people struggle through something and say something brilliant every once in a while, but struggle through the shit. And I appreciate Rogan's opinion too, that like there's something beautiful about the sloppiness of language too.
Yeah, I think we'll have to figure out how that works in the context of human evolution, and does it, this goes into that whole conversation around CRISPR and genetic modification, and like, if we could add new senses to the body, which is all possible.
Yeah,
you could have a totally new sense that could be added to your body with technology right now. You could be aware of red light or ultraviolet UV. You could be aware of north, south, west.
You could smell metals and all kinds of plastics. Yeah, it might be too much.
Your brain could be trained for it. The question is, should it be?
No,
and that's where I think you're always going to have that balancing act of, where does progress potentially become evil, or misused.
Right.
I don't know. I don't have an. I would.
I don't either. I want to.
Go ahead.
Can I share with you one more thing? Last night, this may not be relevant at all, but I've laughed at myself thinking about it. I'm in bed last night. We had all of our windows open, right? It's like 3 a.m, and I wake up to the sound of an animal screaming, and a group of animals all kind of like purring, like I think they were coyotes, and I think they were tearing apart a possum. And the possum was screaming bloody murder. And it went on for like 5 minutes. It was horrible. I felt like even going downstairs, maybe breaking it up, but I was too morbidly curious to hear the death throes of an animal in the middle of being torn apart by a group of animals. And I was like, this is what Nick Goodin is all about, man. I could be a freaking caveman, and now I could put this on a wall. This is awesome, because it was so emotional. And so, but at the same time, distant. I was like listening to it and examining it. I was like, this is proto story. I'm hearing the raw. I'm hearing an animal being ripped to shreds and screaming out his death throes, and other animals kind of like giggling. They're giggling. It sounded like, and I was like, this is sick, cool stuff. But anyways, I thought about that. I thought about like the primordial material of story, and I also thought about how, evolutionarily speaking, how the storyteller was probably more attractive to a mate, more contributing to maybe the success of a tribe, because if they can tell like how the animals move, right, and tell them stories about the great hunt, and that story could be replicated in another hunt, right? That was an evolutionary ability to tell stories, and maybe that's why we all value it, because it's all in us. The great storytellers actually bred with each other, right? So we can talk about that next time. But this is a very deep subject, man, for me anyways.
You're nailing it. Well, and that's why I think thanks for holding space for it to be deep too, because that's why I think it's so much more than just, like, oh, here's how to do a 3-part act, and here's, the story spine, or here's how Pixar writes their stories. We could do all that. I know a lot of that. But it really gets down to the why. Why is storytelling so powerful? I know we didn't get into this, but the neuroscience behind storytelling is extremely fascinating. How it holds our attention. It breaks that 13, 16-second daydream cycle, especially really good storytelling, because what happens is the mirror neurons kick on, and it actually disrupts the I am listening to respond. It's why you can sit down in front of a movie and just disconnect and leave,
right,
and let the story go for you. It's our brain's ability, and a lot of healing happens during storytelling as well. There's a lot of mental flexibility that's going on during storytelling. It calms the nervous system. I mean, there's so much to it. Why is it so primal? I would love to know. Because maybe there's some really interesting data that's been found. I know some of the people that I want to study next are people that have studied the Egyptians, because they seem to be like some of the early masters of storytelling, even before the Greeks. And that a lot of the Greeks storytelling ability, actually, if you look at some of the way that stories were told and modeled, that some of that stuff you can find that in Egyptian hieroglyphs, like the process and the pacing and all that stuff. So
yeah. Well, like any good story, I'm gonna put to be
Yeah.
continued, right?
yeah. All right, man. Take care.
Okay. Well, thank you, man. I'll see you next time, and you take care. Okay.